Hope that you're doing well on this Wednesday evening. We're going to continue our study of the books of First and Second Kings. So if you have your Bible, go ahead and be opening to First Kings chapter 12, which is where we will study tonight. In this particular chapter, what we are looking at is one of the darkest moments in Israel's history, and that is the kingdom will divide. And the 10 northern tribes will be known as Israel the majority of the time, and the two southern tribes will then be known as Judah. And so we're going to look at the events surrounding that. The year is around 930 BC. And so from this point forward, Israel will never really be the same again until they go off into captivity. And when they return, there will be a reunification of the tribes, but never in the way that it was during the days of Saul, David, and Solomon. And so as we think about this chapter, this outline, I don't believe, is original with me. I think I got it from someone who gave something similar. So I'm not sure if I'm giving exactly the outline he gave, but it's just a two simple part outline of chapter 12. First, you have an assembly where they get together and they discuss the things that are going on. That is, they make a plea to Rehoboam and promise to serve him if he will be faithful or if he will lighten their burdens. And then you see the aftermath, the fallout, when things don't go well. And you see that aftermath really take on two different aspects. And so as we think about this chapter, we're looking at the kingdom dividing. And first, let's begin with the assembly. As we said, the year is 930 BC. Rehoboam is the king. That was the last verse of chapter 11, verse 43. And Solomon slept with his fathers and was buried in the city of David, his father, and Rehoboam, his son, reigned in his place. Now, Rehoboam, when he became king, was 41 years old. 41 years old. And when you look at 2 Chronicles 12 and verse 13, an account of his reign, it tells us that he began to reign at age 41. And so it says, Rehoboam went to Shechem, for all Israel had come to Shechem to make him king. Now, this is quite interesting to begin with. First of all, he goes to Shechem. The first thing that's interesting is that he goes to meet them instead of them coming to meet him. For an example, when David was made the king over the United Kingdoms in 2 Samuel 5, 1 through 5, it was the leaders that came to him. And so the fact that he's going to meet Israel at this location may indicate something about that something isn't exactly right at this moment. Now, the second thing is the place of the meeting. It's in Shechem. Now, David had been in Hebron when they came to him, and Solomon, you remember at the beginning of the book, was anointed king at the Gihon Spring. But here he's going to Shechem. Now, Shechem is an important city in its history and its location. For an example, it was a place of covenant renewal. When you look at Joshua 24, Joshua addresses the people and calls them to covenant renewal. It was a place where Abimelech announced himself to be king in the days of the judges, where they first tried that. Remember, they go to Gideon in chapter 8 and ask him to be king, chapter 8, verses 22 and 23, and then he refuses, and then Abimelech kills his brothers and moves forward and tries to exalt himself as king. Of course, it's short-lived, and he's certainly wasn't the first king in Israel. But so it has that idea behind it. It's also, you can kind of see it as, this place where they come together and read the law and reaffirm the covenant. And so it's a place where a decision, it's kind of like a deciding ground. And so it's interesting that they call Rehoboam here to meet with Israel, because they're deciding whether or not they want to continue to have the house of David to reign over them. Because of, as we'll see in just a moment, the amount of work that they have put on them and taxation and things along that line, they're just burnt out. And so they call him to Shechem, and he goes and meets them. Verse 2, and as soon as Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, heard of it, for he was still in Egypt, where he had fled from Solomon, then Jeroboam returned from Egypt. Now, you remember, we met Jeroboam. He was the individual who caused Solomon trouble, that God raised up from the inside, and God had made him great promises that he would be king over the 10 northern tribes as long as he was faithful. And so he's been down in Egypt because Solomon sought to kill him. And now that Solomon is dead, he returns home, and he kind of takes on the face of this movement. They use him to make the appeal to Rehoboam, it seems. And so in verse 3, it says, and they sent and called him, and Jeroboam and all the assembly of Israel came and said to Rehoboam, your father made our yoke heavy. Now therefore lighten the hard service of your father and his heavy yoke on us, and we will serve you. Now, one thing I failed to point out at the very beginning is that this chapter carries with it a lot of similarities to the occasion of the Exodus. So you have a king who has burdened the people, given them a lot of work. And when he's given the chance to make the right decision, he makes the work even harder, the same way Pharaoh did, similar to the way he hardened his heart to the task of letting the people of Israel go from Egypt. Also, Jeroboam will play the role of a new Moses. It seems like it starts out hopeful. That is that he's going to be the one that's chosen to lead them from the bondage of the family of Solomon. But then it's unfortunate he's going to turn out to be really a new Aaron who's going to lead them into idolatry. And so when you think about this, he said, your father made our yoke heavy, our service heavy. It's similar, you remember, to what was said of the Egyptian taskmasters in Exodus 1 and verse 14 and Exodus 2 and verse 23. And so he says he made our yoke heavy. Now, what exactly the yoke is here? It could be taxation. It could be just drafting people into the labor force to go about his building projects. And there may be something to that based upon an event that happens later in the chapter in the second half with a man who is named Adoram. And so there may be some indicators there, but either way, they have grievances and they're trying to air those grievances to Rehoboam to see if things can change. Now, here's what we need to understand. It was not uncommon in these cultures that when a new king came to power, that he would lower taxes and he would give them benefits and try and make things easier to win their favor and to try and start out his reign in a way of goodwill. And so they're coming to him to air these grievances. And so he says in verse 5, go away for 3 days, then come again to me. So the people went away. So he said, I need 3 days to think about it. And so this is what happens. Verse 6. Then King Rehoboam took counsel with the old men who had stood before Solomon his father while he was still yet alive, saying, how do you advise me to answer this people? Now, again, these are the advisors of the wisest man who ever lived. But we saw in chapter 11 that he didn't live up to his wisdom, that there was a difference between knowing it and practicing it. And so he asked them what he should do. Verse 7, and they said to him, if you will be a servant to the people today and serve them and speak good words to them when you answer them, then they will be your servants forever. And so what they're saying here is give the people what they want. They're not being unreasonable. And it may tell you that even Solomon's advisors didn't agree with everything that Solomon was doing, because on this occasion, what are they saying? Lighten it up on the people. Solomon has been too hard on them. He has demanded too much in taxation. He has demanded too much in forced labor, and they've been burnt out by all of this. And so they give the older counsel that says, lighten it up, serve the people, show the people that you're a servant leader, and they will serve you. Verse 8, but he abandoned the counsel of the old men that the old men gave him and took counsel with the young men who had grown up with him and stood before him. Now, young men here, of course, we said Rehoboam is 41 years old. And so these are men probably in their 30s and 40s. How old the men were who were advisors to Solomon, who knows? Probably significantly older, 60s, 70s, 80s. If the average lifespan didn't usually go much further than that, especially in a time without modern medicine. And so he's taking advice from men who, by the way, have grown up with a silver spoon in their mouth. They don't really understand reality. They've never really lived in the real world and never understood the people that they're supposed to be caring for and representing. And so in verse 9, it says, he said to them, what do you advise that we answer this people who have said to me, lighten the yoke that your father put on us? And the young men who had grown up with him said to him, thus shall you speak to the people who said to you, your father made our yoke heavy, but you lighten it for us. Thus shall you say to them, my little finger is thicker than my father's thighs. Now, so you have two different schools of thought on how to handle this situation. The older men say, serve the people and they'll serve you. Meet them in the middle and things will work out well. The younger men say, in essence, I'm going to be harder on you and that you're just complaining. There's not a real problem here. And so my little finger is going to be thicker than my father's thigh. And so you haven't seen hard times yet. You haven't seen hard work yet. You're going to regret going through this. You're going to wish you were back under my father because it's going to be much more difficult for you. So he answers them very roughly according to the counsel that he has given. And so in verse 11, it says, and now whereas my father laid on you a heavy yoke, I will add to your yoke. My father disciplined you with whips, but I will discipline you with scorpions. Okay. And so as the father, Solomon is seen as disciplining with whips. He's making it a little difficult, chastising them. I'm going to do it with scorpions. It may be that it was a certain type of whip that left a sting like a scorpion, or that it was a certain type of whip, similar, not exactly the same, but somewhat similar to what Jesus received in his flogging during his crucifixion, or just before his crucifixion, where it would have maybe animal bones or nail shards or something along that line to really beat up the skin and to wound the skin. And so what he's saying is, I'm going to make it exponentially harder for you. So he answers them very roughly in this leadership, which is the same way, by the way, Pharaoh answered initially. You remember in Exodus 5 that Pharaoh basically said, if you guys have got time to complain, you've got too much time, so I'm going to stop gathering straw. No more is the straw going to be brought to you so that you can use that straw then to make bricks. I'm going to demand the same amount of bricks from you, but apparently you got so much time on your hands that you can complain. I'm going to make you go and cut the straw as well, and then bring it and make the bricks and produce the same amount of bricks. And so it's very similar in that. Verse 12, so Jeroboam and all the people came to Rehoboam the third day, and the king said, come to me again the third day. Or as the king said, come to me again the third day. And the king answered the people harshly, and forsaking the counsel that the old men had given him, he spoke to them according to the counsel of the young men, saying, my father made your yoke heavy, but I will add to your yoke. My father disciplined you with whips, but I will discipline you with scorpions. So the king did not listen to the people, and it was a turn of affairs brought about by the Lord, that he might fulfill his word, which the Lord spoke by Ahijah the Shilonite to Jeroboam the son of Nebat. Now that's a reference, obviously, to chapter 11. And that text begins in chapter 11, verse 26 through verse 40. And so he refuses their counsel. Now, what we see here is this interesting tension that exists between God's sovereignty and the free will of humanity. This text makes very clear, and you look at chapter 11 and the text that precedes it, and it's very clear as well, that this division comes from God. But yet God is sovereignly in control of it, but yet he uses the foolish decision of Rehoboam to bring about that division. Now, had Rehoboam behaved himself with wisdom, I have no doubts that the division would have come in another way based upon a man making a choice that was not wise. But God uses his foolish choice to bring about his designed end, and that is to punish Israel, to punish the house of Solomon for the idolatry of Solomon. And so that's really the big thing here. Certainly we can take the lesson of listening to the right kind of advice, but we need to see in the greater picture that this is the working of God, and that he's the one in control of the situation, and it's playing out exactly how he said it would. And so that's the assembly. It does not go well. So what we read for the rest of this chapter, and even you could say throughout the rest of the book of First Kings and on into Second Kings, is just the aftermath of it. Everything falls. Everything just falls apart. And we've called our study The Rise and the Ruin of Israel. And we talked about how in chapter 10, we kind of hit the peak. That was the rise of Israel. And chapter 11, Solomon started things downhill, and now it's about to pick up and roll down that hill like a freight train. And it's just going to get progressively worse and worse, unfortunately, for Israel. So in verse 16, it says, and when all Israel saw that the king did not listen to them, the people answered the king, what portion do we have in David? We have no inheritance in the son of Jesse. To your tents, O Israel. Look now to your own house, David. So Israel went to their tents. In essence, they said, we're seceding. We're leaving. You're not going to rule over us anymore. It's very similar to what was said in Sheba's rebellion in 2 Samuel 20 and verse 1. And so we don't have any inheritance. We don't have any part with you. We don't have any relationship with you. We're done. And so they withdraw. Verse 17, but Rehoboam reigned over the people of Israel who lived in the cities of Judah. Then King Rehoboam sent Adoram, who was the taskmaster over the forced labor, and all Israel stoned him to death with stones. And so Rehoboam is very, you might say, politically tone deaf. Okay. So he makes this decision They say they don't want anything else to do with them. And then he sends out the man over forced labor. It seems to be the same man or known as Adoniram, 2 Samuel 20 and verse 24, 1 Kings 4:6, 1 Kings 5:14, serving under the reign of David, the reigns of David and Solomon, was the captain of the forced labor under Solomon. And so it seems as if he sends. Now, these people have just said, we're leaving the nation of Israel. We're going to form our own nation, basically, because you put too much work on us. And he sends out the man in charge of forced labor into their midst, as if he thinks they're not going to follow through on their promise. He thinks that they're just upset and they didn't really mean it. Well, they meant it so much that they killed this man, the representative of Rehoboam, stoned him to death. And then it says, and King Rehoboam hurried to the mountain of the chariot to flee to Jerusalem. That is, when he heard what had happened, he realized, oh, this is a much bigger situation than I thought it was. And so now he's running for his own life, thinking, of course, well, I'm next. So Israel, verse 19, has been in rebellion against the house of David to this day. That is, as the person who is writing the book of Kings says, to this day, Israel wants nothing to do with Judah. Verse 20, and when all Israel heard that Jeroboam had returned, they sent and called him to the assembly and made him king over all Israel. There was none that followed the house of David, but the tribe of Judah only. And so they call in Jeroboam and say, we want you to be our king. You've proven yourself. Of course, he led them through this endeavor, led them through the meetings with King Rehoboam. And of course, this is in fulfillment of the prophecy that God had made, or that God sent through his prophet in chapter 11. And so now he is king. And you remember, God had made him the promise that if you will be faithful to me and you will trust me and walk in my ways, I will establish for you a house the same way I established David's house. You will continue to prosper as long as you trust me. Now, after Rehoboam hears that Jeroboam is the new king over the 10 northern tribes, it says in verse 21, when Rehoboam came to Jerusalem, he assembled all the house of Judah and the tribe of Benjamin, 180,000 chosen warriors to fight against the house of Israel, to restore the kingdom to Rehoboam, the son of Solomon. And so he goes and he thinks war is what's going to reunite these two nations. I've got to go after these tribes that are rebelling. And so he moves to go to war. But verse 22, the word of God came to Shemaiah, the man of God, say to Rehoboam, the son of Solomon, king of Judah, and to all the house of Judah and Benjamin, and to the rest of the people, thus says the Lord, you shall not go up or fight your relatives, the people of Israel. Every man return to his home, for this thing is from me. So they listened to the word of the Lord and went home again, according to the word of the Lord. And so God sends his prophet that we don't know a lot about. We see him mentioned only other time in 2 Chronicles 12, verses 5 through 18, and then in verse 15 with his interaction here with Rehoboam. And then, of course, he's involved, 2 Chronicles chapter 12 and verse 15. He's involved in the writing of the history of the reign of Rehoboam. And he comes and tells them the word of the Lord that says, do not go to war. This is from me. This is a divine decree. This was according to my plan. Don't try and reverse what has been done. And to their credit, they listen. It's as if Rehoboam has kind of learned his lesson by not listening to wise counsel the first time. It got him into a whole lot of trouble. And so now he listens to the word of the Lord. And actually, for the first few years of his reign, what we learn about him later, especially when you read the Chronicles, is that in the first few years of his reign, he does what God wants him to do. He learns that lesson, but then it's like year 5, he just flips a switch and becomes a different man and refuses to listen to the Lord anymore. And so you've got the kingdoms divided and they're split. It's a dark moment in Israel. Their power is divided. So they no longer have the unified army. They no longer have the subservient nations paying taxes. They've now got to figure out how to regulate and do all these different things and how to fight off enemies. And it's just a whole new world in front of them. And so that's basically what Jeroboam does now in the next verses, is he moves to establish himself and his kingdom in a way that is not good. And it will ultimately lead to their demise. As a matter of fact, in 2 Kings 17, verses 20 through 23, we'll read about that. God will say, this is why when they're taken off into Assyrian captivity, he will cite this occasion in verses 25 through the end of the chapter, verse 33, as one of the primary reasons why they ended up going into Assyrian captivity. So the text says in verse 25, then Jeroboam built Shechem in the hill country of Ephraim and lived there. And he went out from there and built Penuel. And so the first thing he does is these moves of Shechem and Penuel are about solidifying his capital city and solidifying his economic interests. Okay. Now, at the same time that he's doing this, in 2 Chronicles 11, 5 through 12, Rehoboam is also rebuilding fortified cities because now they are two different nations and they have different boundaries. And so they need fortifications in the right place to protect them from enemies, not just from one another, but from other enemies as well that might invade. And so they move and go through this process. Now, Shechem would become the capital city. Now, Samaria will later become the primary capital. The city itself will be built, and we'll see that in a few chapters. But Shechem still remains a pretty central location. It guards the west-east pass throughout the nation of Israel. And so it's very strategically important, along with many other things. And of course, this was where they had the meeting at the beginning of the chapter. And so in a sense, you can almost say it's like a slap in the face to Rehoboam, because we're going to make the capital in the very place where we overthrew you. And so we wanted nothing more to do with you. And so he puts it there, but also in Penuel, it is a caravan road that connected Gilead to Damascus, to the very northeast, far northeast of the nation of Israel. And so it's protecting their capital, it's protecting their economic interest, and it's protecting their borders and the interest of their borders and the safety of their people. And so he does that. And then, that was a good move. Okay. Smart move. You would expect it. But his next move is the one for which he will be known. And it's the one in which he basically takes the promise of God and refuses to trust it, because God has already told him that if you will simply just serve me, everything's going to be okay. I mean, I'm the one who made this decision to begin with. So if you'll serve me, you won't have to worry about anything. But he doesn't believe the word of God, basically. There's really no other way to put it. And so it says in verse 26, and when Jeroboam said in his heart, now the kingdom will turn back to the house of David. If this people go up to offer sacrifices in the temple of the Lord at Jerusalem, then the heart of this people will turn again to their Lord, to Rehoboam, king of Judah, and they will kill me and return to Rehoboam, king of Judah. And so even though Jeroboam has been appointed king, he doesn't really see himself as king. He thinks people are still kind of caught up in the moment, that if they start going back to the temple to worship, they're going to return to, as he calls him, their Lord, the King Rehoboam. Again, not trusting what God has said, that he's now the king, and that they're not going back to the house of Rehoboam. God has already decreed that. And so that leads him into, instead of trusting God's word as spoken to him directly through his prophet, he goes the opposite direction. And he trusts his fears instead, which lead him to a monumental mistake, not just for himself and not just for the people that lived under his particular reign for those years, but for generations to come. It wreaked havoc. So the king, verse 28, took counsel and made 2 calves of gold. And he said to the people, you have gone up to Jerusalem long enough. Behold your gods, O Israel, that brought you up out of the land of Egypt. And he set one in Bethel and the other he put in Dan. Now, this particular section, verses 25 through 33, you might read Exodus 32. You remember when the children of Israel come out of Egypt and Moses is up on the mountain getting the law, and he's been there for a long time. And so they come to Aaron and say, we don't know what's happened to Moses. Make us a god. And he takes their earrings and their jewelry and he makes a golden calf. And he's going to declare a feast, Exodus 32 and verse 5. And so this is very similar. So you've got these 2 golden calves. And the Chronicles account and 2 Chronicles 11 tell us it wasn't just golden calves, it was also golden goats as well. And so this is clearly, now there's debate about, did Jeroboam intend for these calves to be representative of idolatry, just going full-fledged into idolatry, or is he saying these calves are a stand-in for God, kind of like the Ark of the Covenant? I'm not really convinced of that, to be honest with you. I think the arguments for it are extremely weak. I think this is full-fledged idolatry. I don't believe he has any inkling of desiring to honor the God of Israel in this behavior. But so on the face of it, he violates definitely, I mean, without controversy, he violates commandment 2 of the 10 commandments, which says you should not make any graven image. God cannot be confined to a structure. God can't be defined to an idol or an image. And so even if, as some people suppose, that he is, these are representative of God, he's broken the idolatry command as far as making the image itself. But he's also, in my judgment, and based upon the way the Old Testament, in chapter 14 and verse 9, Hosea, the prophet to the north, Amos, the prophet to the north, they make it pretty clear that this was about idolatry, beginning to end. This was all about idolatry. And so there's really not much to save face for it. This is about abandoning God and going into idolatry. And so he sets them up in Dan and Bethel. Dan is the northernmost point in Israel, the 10 northern tribes, and Bethel is the southernmost point of the 10 northern tribes. Now, you remember, when they were united, they were described as from Dan to Beersheba, Dan being the northernmost point and Beersheba being the southernmost point. But now that you have the 10 northern tribes, you have Dan, the northernmost point, and Bethel, which is only about 11 miles from the city of Jerusalem. But Bethel also enjoys a rich history. This is a place where you can look at Abraham and the patriarchs. They had great interactions with God at Bethel. Jacob, Genesis 28, when he sleeps on the stone, sees the ladder from heaven coming down and has this great interaction with God and is later confirmed and wrestles with the angel in this same region in Genesis 35. And so he chooses Bethel. And he chooses Dan for these locations and says, behold your gods, O Israel, that brought you up out of Egypt. That idol didn't do anything. Verse 30, then this thing became a sin for the people, when as far as Dan to be before one. Then this thing became a sin for the people, went as far as Dan to be before one. They went to worship. Now Bethel became really the primary location. It's the location visited in the next chapter with the prophet who confronts this idolatry. It's also visited, spoken of by Amos the prophet in Amos chapter 7, verses 10 through 17. Hosea mentions it in Hosea 10, 5 and 6. And so Bethel became kind of the central location. Archaeologists have unearthed what they believe to be the high place that was consecrated, I should say, in Dan to one of these golden calves. It was 195 feet by 145 feet, so pretty large. High place, had a great open courtyard and things along that line. And so they've gone into idolatry and embraced it wholeheartedly. But then he takes it even further. He also made temples on high places and appointed priests from all the people who were not of the Levites. Now, the priesthood was supposed to be the children of Israel. Now, of course, it seems as if he's kind of creating his own new religion for his new state. And so he appoints them from different tribes. Now, the Old Testament was extremely clear that the Levites were your priests. Remember, all priests had to be Levites, but not all Levites were priests. Numbers 3 and 4 shows us the kind of different roles that they had in the relationship of the service of the temple. Matter of fact, Chronicles in 2 Chronicles 11, 13 through 14 or 15, the priests leave the 10 northern tribes and come down and present themselves to Rehoboam, saying, he's cast us out and we're here to serve. We're not going to stand behind this. And what's interesting in this is that this is actually how Levi kind of set itself apart in the very beginning. In the Exodus 32 debacle, the descendants of Levi didn't get involved in the worship of the golden calf. And that partially led to them being placed in the priestly role. And so that's what we're seeing here, the Levites. So he's directly going against what God has said as he moves into this. And then in verse 32, he sets up a feast, similar to what Aaron was going to do in Exodus 32 and verse 5. It says, Jeroboam appointed a feast on the 15th day of the 8th month, like the feast that was in Judah, and he offered sacrifices on the altar. Now, like the feast that was in Judah, what it seems that he's doing is the feast that he seems to be referencing is the Feast of Tabernacles, which was on the 15th day of the 7th month. You remember when the temple under Solomon was dedicated at the Feast of Tabernacles. And so he purposefully changes the date of his feast to make it somewhat similar, but yet be different. So he did in Bethel, sacrificing to the calves that he made and placed them in Bethel and the priests and the high places that he had made. And he went up to the altar that he made in Bethel on the 15th day in the 8th month, in the month that he had devised in his own heart. There it is. This wasn't about God. He's making it up as he's going along. How can these gods be legitimate? He's making it up as he goes along, as he devises it in his heart. And he instituted a feast for the people of Israel and went up to the altar to make offerings. Dark, dark moment. You see, God sovereignly ordained that there be a division between the tribes of Israel, but he ordained a political division. He did not ordain a theological division. He had zero desire that they abandon him and to go into idolatry. He never desires that, and especially on this occasion. But you know what this does is it really sets the stage for what we're going to read about in the next section of the prophets. You remember, this chapter begins a new section about the division of the kingdom and how those divisions become deepened and solidified. But then we come to chapter 17, and carrying over into the first few chapters of 2 Kings, we see there's this new section where it becomes the kings versus the prophets, where kings are making decisions that are poor, and God sends his prophets to communicate and to call the kings and the people back to the way of God. And so this sets the stage. This is kind of that beginning point where the kings and prophets are not going to work in harmony together very much. I mean, they will on occasion, but not very much. They're going to stand against one another in this process. And God is going to raise up prophet after prophet after prophet to try and save his people in the midst of this epidemic of idolatry. And so as we look at 1 Kings chapter 12, we're looking at one of the darkest moments in the history of Israel. They've divided and they have abandoned God in the process. What started out as a political division, which God had ordained, now turns into a theological division, which God certainly never wanted. And so what we have to pay attention to is the importance, even what we see here with what Jeroboam does. We see the importance of doing things God's way and not creating or devising ways in our own heart and saying, God had already told Jeroboam what to do. And he goes on his own. He fabricates this entire new religion based upon whatever he devises in his heart. It can't succeed because of that. God will be against it, and he is. And so that sets the stage. And now in chapter 13, God will immediately move to cry out against what it is that Jeroboam has done. And we hope that you'll be with us as we continue down this journey and down this study.